I'm going to call this I Stayed, and it's going to take a while to make, so this is the very first part of it. Here we go. I stayed when I flirted with you, and you decided that was a perfect opportunity to tell me about the guy that you cheated on your ex-husband with, and how every bit of that went down. I stayed when I said something about you having amazing boobs, and you decided that was a great opportunity to talk about your best friend's lizard for 30 minutes. I stayed when you stayed as far on your side of the bed as you could possibly get without falling off of it, rolled up in a blanket by yourself every night. I stayed when we didn't have sex for 5 months. And yeah, it was right about that time if you add the two together. Because it was 2.5 months and 2.5 months. We had sex one time. So like 5 months if you add it all together. I stayed when my stomach hurt from all the fucking fast food. I stayed when I couldn't shit right because of all the grease I'd been eating. Because that's the only way you would eat. I stayed when your head hurt so bad you were crying because the only thing you drank for weeks was Mountain Dew and coffee. I stayed when my feet were swollen from running up and down stairs all day at work, and you'd been in bed for 18 hours. I stayed when I had to scrub the house from top to bottom for a fire inspection because we failed the first time and we were going to get kicked out if we didn't, and you wouldn't get out of the bed and help. Your exact words were, "Fuck them people, I ain't cleaning shit." And you went to bed. I stayed. I stayed when I was having to give you every spare nickel I had just to keep you afloat because I loved you. I stayed every time I sent you a selfie and you zoomed in to find something to roast me for. You roasted me over a nose hair one time in a selfie after I had just gotten a haircut before I just gave up and started shaving it all off again. I stayed when I had to give up my vacation to Austin to pay your phone bill. I stayed when I withdrew every nickel I had in my savings account to get you that house. You know, the one you refused to clean? I stayed when it was 105 degrees outside. I had sweat coming out every pore of my body. I was so exhausted, it hurt. And yet, I came home, took a shower, and did the dishes and cleaned the kitchen because it stank so bad because you had another migraine. I stayed when for 4 years you took the day off work on my birthday to spend the day with me, but instead you slept all day and giggled about it. I stayed when you complained all through Valentine's dinner about work and how you just wanted to go home and go to bed and watch TV. When you complained all through dinner, when you did nothing but complain all day on Valentine's Day. I stayed when we didn't have sex for the 3rd year in a row on Valentine's Day. I stayed that time I spent all day running around trying to get a haircut and spent every last nickel I had to go buy a shirt and tie and some pants to look good for your uncle's Christmas party. And the first thing you'd said when I asked you how I looked was you doubled over laughing, pointed at my pants, and said, "Your fucking zipper's down." I will never forget that as long as I fucking live. I spent all day just trying to look good for you so you wouldn't be embarrassed in front of your family, and you did that to me. And I will never forget that. I stayed. That time, I finally had Saturday off for the first time in a while. And I was so excited to go to the club with you, and that's all I wanted to do. But we left after 30 minutes because you kept flopping around in the booth and sighing like a bored freshman. And I finally got it out of you that you just wanted to go back home and go to bed. You had already been asleep for 16 hours that day. I stayed. That time I asked you to look into therapy through your job. And you giggled and said, well, I would have to call on my lunch break and that would interfere with my nap. I stayed. That one time you got a job after work because I just didn't have any money to give you through your ex-boyfriend and didn't tell me about it. I stayed when you and your best friend talked about your fuckboy in front of me. Yeah, we were at dinner. I stayed when you came home with chlamydia. When we hadn't had sex in over a month and a half. I stayed when we caught your mom stealing from us. I stayed when I knew other people were stealing from me. I stayed every time you called in for work for a migraine, but you still haven't been to a headache specialist. I stayed every time you wouldn't go to sleep, but yet you've still never been to a sleep specialist either. I stayed that summer that every time you had to get up and go to work, you said nothing for 2.5 hours but bitching, moaning, and crying about how you had to be out of bed. While I was at work, running up and down stairs with heat rash. Sweating to pay the fucking bills. And all you could do is complain about fucking going to work. I stayed. That year on my birthday, I had to go donate plasma to go buy the groceries to have your friends over for my birthday dinner. And you still didn't get out of bed till 6 o'clock that night. I stayed. That time my sinus hurt so bad that I felt like the front of my face was about to explode. And you diagnosed me with the man flu so you could keep bitching about work. I stayed. All those nights I spent downstairs on the couch by myself so you could sleep because of whatever was wrong with you. I stayed all those Saturdays I was off and I had to get up and clean my own house. And you didn't get out of bed till noon. Yeah, I stayed. I stayed all those times I had to move my car payment around to help you pay your rent before we moved in together. I stayed when I gave you my holiday overtime. I stayed that time I asked you to rub my shoulders for me because they were sore as shit from work. And you looked at me and said, I quote, "That's a lot of work. Don't you have an edible you could take?" I stayed every time I had achieved something and ran upstairs to tell you, and you just went, "That's nice," and went back to watching television. I stayed as I watched my overtime checks evaporate to your DoorDash orders because you would spend $100 on DoorDash before you would get up and microwave yourself a burrito for dinner. I stayed every time your mother disrespected me in front of you, and you just stood there and never said a word.